like the critiques, or sorry, measure the trends that we want to highlight against radically imagining what racial justice looks like.
Also,
Yeah.
for Lorraine's sake, would you mind standing on the other side of your paper, just so she can see you on
Oh,
the video?
okay.
Thank you.
Cool.
Perfect.
So starting with some of these which are obviously barriers but could be turned into opportunities. I think if we do a proper analysis of it, one of the things that we discussed was under the current conditions, there being a lot of discussion about radically imagining what racial justice and transformation looks like, including, for example, our work being funded to address things like white supremacy and having a strong racial justice underpinning to our work. And yet, in spite of that, often that's not the kind of work that, or trends that we see in the field that's actually being funded when you actually look at the work that's being funded, the way in which grantees are able to use those funds. So one of the things that we see that as a challenge, that in fact it's dangerous for us to be throwing around white supremacy and racial justice very loosely when that's not actually what's being funded and translates into action on the ground. And so feel that there's a need to kind of do a deep reckoning with that. One example on the flip side of that was thinking about the kinds of tactics that would otherwise might not get funded by funders in this work, right? So even if we're talking about needing radical change, one of the examples is if we had grantees that would be talking about occupying empty jails that have now been defunded, for example. If we think about like what the development of a recession and global recession might look like and the opportunities for an Occupy 2.0 might be. Would that be a space where we are preparing our organizers, whether they're youth or adults, to be able to take opportunities that are presented by that kind of gap by using radical tactics, because that's what we need to do. And so there's a kind of question around whether there's a barrier to that. Are we actually funding the kinds of radical organizing that's going to be necessary to address the systemic challenges we see? The second one, this is maybe just a little bit easier to describe initially. And a big barrier is the fact that there is massive amounts of funding going into community organizing funded by the right that's often taking up the space that we as progressive and radical organizers are supposed to be taking. So that's an obvious threat. There is perhaps an opportunity in that space to think about what are the tactics that the right are using that's co-opting the way in which we do our organizing work that might even inform how it is that we either get ahead of that. Or there was an example earlier on that was given about how progressive foundations tend to be funding project-specific work rather than general operating costs. That's not how the right operates in the space that they're busy taking over for us, and so something that we wanted to kind of highlight. Oh, the third one is not actually on this sheet over here, but we did also discuss the limitations of what is often a non-profit or even corporate structure that gets promoted or encouraged, even and in particular youth organizing spaces, right? And that changes the nature of organizing and who it is that leadership of youth organizing groups in particular are actually accountable to. So if you have an executive director, for example, of a youth movement that has a board and funders that it has to be responsible to, are they going to be accountable to them or to the membership? There's a lot more discussion about that, but there's perhaps a question around the kinds of structures that we are funding and running, and whether or not they actually further democratic practices and democratic structures that help to center actual youth, and this in the youth space in particular, youth decision making. We also see that as being a barrier to mass-based organizing and big base building development. So those are both threats and opportunities of the first view.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then we also talked, so in terms of youth justice, right, in terms of the goal of ending youth incarceration, we talked about how this is about intergenerational movement building, right? And we talked about in terms of the opportunities, we see major opportunities, if well resourced, to be able to make significant strides, right, towards that goal through movement efforts that are led by those who are most directly impacted. But we also talked about how we need to broaden the lens of juvenile justice, right? And that what we're talking about is ending criminalization. We're talking about ending mass incarceration. We're talking about holistic investments in communities, and how so often through, like Dmitri mentioned, through project support, the lens of what is funded and considered fundable is very limited. and how do we, out of the necessity of what is needed on the ground as we work to end prisons, but what do we want in our communities, right? That what do we want in our communities has to be funded equally as the end game of closing prisons. We also talked about how the problem, when we talk about racial justice, right, when we talk about structural racism that's so deeply embedded, is that we all know from history that problems in the way racism takes form just keeps changing and morphing over time. So as we have this goal of ending youth incarceration, how do we make sure that similar racist systems aren't continuing to oppress and hold down young people in their communities? And the only way that we can do that is if we can really be rooted in building strong community-led movements and having resources to have long-term vision and long-term strategy as we are doing that critical, extremely hard work of these shorter-term campaigns that we're working on.
We have space for anyone from our group to add if they,
Yes, please.
Yeah.
And any,
just in case we must.
any additions from the group, yeah. Questions? Questions?
Maybe some examples, Jenny, about what has been like the transmutation of the problems. Because a lot of folks weren't.
Yeah. Do you want to give your example?
Oh,
Yeah.
I had a lot. Which one are you?
In the South, how if you might close the youth prison, but then you have the youth opportunity centers.
There was one.
Sorry.
So,
Go stand up there. Thank you.
And so there are many examples, and we talked about one specific example in the South, and then we all have examples.
yeah, specifically in the South, we were talking about how, you know, we might have a win about like closing a youth prison or about like not expanding a youth prison, but then young people end up being incarcerated in other more subversive ways, whether it's like ankle bracelets, whether it's, you know, home monitoring, those type of things. And then also talking about like narratives, so then the name of the juvenile detention center is changed so that it doesn't obviously seem like a juvenile detention center, so it's like the youth study center, yay. Or it's an opportunity center and it's no longer, you know, it's an opportunity for young people to think about their reasons for being incarcerated. So like in those ways, there's a co-optation of language and like movement language around equity, diversity, liberation, transformation, everything's transformative. And then it creates like barriers for us that are actually trying to do the work and move some real stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Was that?
That was great,
Okay.
thank you.
Okay.
Not a question, just an observation. I think it's great you gave an example of the South. When I mentioned Corridor of Shame, it's actually a space called the Corridor of Shame in South Carolina, which is the poorest region of the state. And I think oftentimes, even though I'm very concerned about what happens in the cities, oftentimes we forget about what happens in rural areas, particularly when it comes to girls and women. So I'm just happy you guys used the South as an example.
Keisha, did you want to say your opportunity example on Canada?
Oh, my thing. Oh, yes,
You
I
can-
was talking about that. We were talking about that. The stand up. Okay. Well, I just want two opportunities that I think in the workforce world that we're talking about that crosses over is the cannabis industry, and so we have good examples to learn from like Tacoma and Seattle cities and Denver about where the money went and where it didn't go, and also as more legalization happens, what does that look like? We're doing some federal work on that, and then we talked about the green economy, and so those are two big spaces that are being dominated in the workforce world that impact or don't impact or won't impact the young people we're talking about in the communities.
Thank you. All right, thank you for